Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you, and great pleasure to be in Australia. My first visit to this continent, and it's absolutely a pleasure to come after Clarissa. I have to tell you, Clarissa and I worked together in WSP, and everything that I know about sanitation, and certainly anything that I feel that I wanted to know about sanitation, comes from Clarissa. If it had not been for Clarissa, I think I would have gone through my career in WSP without having really focused on sanitation. I really owe her professionally that change in my own thinking about sanitation. I would have actually said, let's go straight to Q&A, because I'm not quite sure what else I'm going to add to Clarissa's presentation. But a little bit of repetition never hurts. So let's start with that. You know, one of the great things about being a parent is when your children grow up and begin to challenge you on your basic fundamentals of what you believe in. And my daughter, who's now in third year university, undergraduate in the United States, has started doing internship as assistant to middle school teachers in teaching math. What she wants to do is teach math in the low-income public schools in the United States. And having gone to the first set of our internship, she came home and she said, you know, how do you hold yourselves accountable? She asked me at the World Bank. Very much the question that was asked by WaterAid: how do multilaterals hold themselves accountable? And I said, look, we measure, and if you can't measure, you can't be held accountable. And she smiled and she said, you know, Dad, I've just started working as an intern in the No Child Left Behind program in the United States. And we measure No Child Left Behind by the statistics of these exams and the scores they pass. And I said, that's exactly right. That's exactly the way to do it. She says, you know, the first thing I learned, the first day I was there, that it's not about those exams that they pass. When there's no trust between the teacher and the student, and especially students coming from broken families, what are you measuring when you try to measure these statistics about No Child Left Behind? What is the difference between measuring passing exams and learning? Then the second thing she said to me is, you know, forcing people to be judged on passing exams. She says, do you know what it does to the behavior of teachers? And I said, no, tell me what it does to the behavior of teachers. She says, this school, I saw teachers actually going into behavior to make sure that their students pass. She says, have you understood that the way you measure often leads to certain very perverse incentives? Well, to have your 19-year-old daughter challenge you on the way you go about doing multilateral business, which is measure access, measure MDGs, and feel good about it, I said to myself, what is it with MDGs that we're measuring, and what is it that we're not measuring? So I wanted to share with you a little bit some of, I think you'll see our collective thinking about what the MDGs are not revealing to us. And I think the first thing that we learn is that it doesn't reveal to us that it's about politics. The failure in water and sanitation, I would submit to you, and I think you will find this fits into your own experience, that the failure is not about technology, it's not about resources, and it's not about capacity. Although all of that matters, it's about the failure of political institutions to deliver. And the MDGs don't measure that. Let me take the example of water from India. In this graph, what you see is there's absolutely no correlation between the amount of water delivered in a city or a state and the number of hours of water that's delivered to households. So you take, for example, a Mumbai or a Delhi, where the amount of water delivered is over 200 liters per person per day, and yet it's 4 to 5 hours of water that's being delivered. This failure of no connection between the amount of water and the amount of water delivered to the citizens is a true example of political failure. Now the question is, why is there no relationship? What's behind this? What's behind it is really blurred accountability. Utilities in India, the urban utilities, face a significant problem that the policymaker, provider, and regulator are all one and the same. So if you take the Chief Minister of Delhi, she is the chair of the water utility, she's the policymaker, and she's also the regulator. When judge and jury are not separated, it's very hard to keep accountability on the utility for delivering. Now, I once spoke to her about that, and she says, the problem is, because I'm chair of the water utility, when people come to me and say, please give me a job, I can't say no. I have to give a job to my constituency. So you can see that she's been put in a position where she has to deliver all in one go. And this we can see across many of the countries where this kind of separation between who provides, who regulates, and who actually is the policymaker is not clarified. And when that's not clarified, accountability suffers. In many of the reforms that we, as the World Bank, are supporting, countries like Senegal, Mozambique as two examples, is precisely the focus is on not measuring in terms of direct access, but measuring whether one can support the governments and the countries create these institutions where the provider and the regulator and the policymaker are truly separated, so there is, if you will, check and balance. And this is the institutional development that is very deep, and it's the institutional development that's very needed, and one that I think the focus on MDGs and numbers of access makes us forget. The second thing MDGs, I think, don't remind us, and something that all of you know, something that Clarissa has pointed out, it's about pricing. I think there's been a myth that free water is the best way to deliver to poor. And I think Akhtar Hamid Khan, the father of, if you will, the whole issue, a whole framework of community delivery and getting community empowered, from which Grameen Bank and others have emerged, has often said that free water and the lack of pricing of water is really the disabling promise of government handout. And what we have learned here, and not captured in the MDG data, is that subsidies are often pro-rich. After all, those who are connected are those who get subsidies. And pricing, on the other hand, can indeed be pro-poor, especially if you take into account the coping costs of the poor and the amount of actual price that they are paying, not only in terms of direct cash to vendors, in terms of time forgone, in terms of poor health. And converting that into a price that makes a provider accountable completely changes the nature of service delivery. Sanitation, I think, is a dramatic case. In India, in Africa, we've seen latrine subsidies. And what, from country to country, we find latrines are subsidized, and those who gain in the subsidy, and this I learned from Kamal Kar, who is somewhere in this audience, is the contractor who develops the latrine is the one who gets it. Because latrines are created but not used. As Clarissa pointed out, that there's been a focus away from latrine production to triggering demand for sanitation. And yet subsidies are in latrine production, not in triggering demand. Pricing, I would argue, is pro-poor, and pricing creates accountability. Third, there's been a paradigm shift, and certainly a paradigm shift in multilateral institutions, that the delivery of water and sanitation is not about ownership, it's about accountability. There was a time that we in the World Bank, for us, it was either private sector participation or nothing. There was a time that we had a sort of a slogan, walk back from water concessions, when we spoke to South Asian policymakers. What we realized that historically, there's been a very, very different approach to development of water utilities in terms of this issue of private sector development. You take United States, for example. United States starts off by creating water utilities by private sector across the country. Then between around 1850 to around 1920, over 85 to 90% of these water utilities get handed over to public ownership under municipalities. You look at Paris, for example. Paris has always been known as a city in which the river divides, the River Seine divides the city into two. One side belongs to one of the big private providers, and the other side belongs to the other private provider. Well, this year, the mayor of Paris has actually decided at the end of the 25-year concession to take back the delivery of water and sanitation into the hands of the city. Now, part of it is still political institutional issues. After all, this mayor wants to show Mr. Sarkozy that private sector and right-wing delivery is not the only way to deliver. Now, but Paris has taken the point that it's not about ownership, it's about accountability of services. Chile corporatized its water and sanitation systems and utility, and for over a decade provided it as publicly provided utilities with an incredible program of cross-subsidy for poor. And it's only recently that they began to bring in private sector players. Why? To get capacity and to get capital. Had nothing to do with in terms of the initial accountability of delivery. Australia, I think, has been in the vanguard of utility reform, where the choice between public and private is kept neutral. It's left completely up to the states and indeed the local governments and not imposed from above. And I'll come back to that story. So the issue that it is PSP, that it is private sector, we have learned that that's not what it is. It's about the institutions and what kind of accountability they create. Now, there's something interesting about the history in the West, that as systems move from private operators, as in the United States, as in Netherlands, into local government and municipal delivery, what stayed constant? What stayed constant was that water remained an economic good to be priced, whether publicly delivered or privately delivered. And that's what created accountability. And second, most important, that there's a separation between the provider, the policymaker, and the regulator. So what private sector set up remained constant in principle under public institutions. Again, confirming that it's those principles that are more important than necessarily PSP. But PSP does matter and can create accountability. In the case of Argentina, for example, about 20 to 25% of the providers are private providers. And what we have seen is that once you create a platform of private providers, it enables you to benchmark the public sector. So it creates the benchmarking, but you don't need to make it 100%. 20% private providers in a country, and certainly in a country like India, would provide the benchmark for that kind of accountability. So private sector can help, but it is not the answer in terms of service delivery. And then I think something very important which got reflected in Clarissa's presentation, what we're learning, that it's only partly about communities. And let me explain. I think that what we've discovered, that where markets fail and where the state fails, collapsing service delivery around communities, whether it's private services or public services, is the best way to provide services. Where? In the context of failed states, in the context of failed markets. Now, we also know that when you do that collapsing, pro-port targeting can indeed be supported by communities. There's quite a bit of check and balance within communities. But again, if you look at history and you look at the gangs of New York syndrome, not all communities, if you will, are egalitarian. In India, Dalits are left behind. In Bangladesh,